now I wish to recognize for an opening statement the ranking member of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin my opening statement, I'd like to submit a number of articles for the record. First of all, from last week's Washington Post, India rejects calls for emission cuts with regards to the president's push to combat climate change. Indian officials said it was unlikely to prompt them to agree to binding emission cuts. From the New York Times, thirsty for energy in India's boomtown and beyond, quote, almost half of India's population has no access to the electricity grid. About 700 million Indians rely on animal waste and firewood as fuel for cooking. From the Saginaw News, terrible time for higher bills. Quote, as a result of the recent green mandate, sticking people with an average of $125 utility bill increase seems kind of cruel in a state that's suffering 12.5% unemployment. From the Detroit News, cap-and-trade plan will hit the heartland with a, quote, cap-and-trade system is a giant economic dagger aimed at the nation's heartland, particularly Michigan. From the Hill, not all senators warming to Obama cap-and-trade. Sherrod Brown, a former member of this committee, Obama's plan would lead to an increase in energy costs and would drive American firms abroad. From the Wall Street Journal, who pays for cap-and-trade? With a, quote, an economy-wide tax under the cover of saving the environment is the best political moneymaker since the income tax. And from U.S. News and World Report, the next Bernie Madoff emissions cap-and-trade aids the corrupt, hurts the little guy, and on and on. I would like in advance to thank the 60-some witnesses who will be testifying before our committee this week. And due to the limited time, I would like to submit the following 4 questions to each of our witnesses and would ask them to address these during their opening remarks. Number 1, will the legislation increase energy costs? If so, is there anything in the underlying bill that prevents these costs from being passed on to consumers? 2, since the legislation applies only to the U.S. but not other nations like China, India, and Mexico, is there a chance it will result in American jobs being shipped overseas, and how many jobs will be lost? 3, what was the cumulative cost per household of this legislation? And 4, absent other nations adopting the same reduction policy, how much will the legislation actually reduce global temperatures, if at all? I do believe that we need to reduce emissions, but we must do it in a common-sense way that takes into account the economic and global realities of the issue. This week was reported in the New York Times that China discovered 180 miles of the Great Wall that they didn't know existed. How on earth are they going to be able to monitor and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions? And I wonder how many coal fire plants that they might have discovered in the last couple of years as they were analyzing this new 180 miles. We're not engaged in a guessing game. We have the luxury of examining empirical evidence of past forays into the different policies. All one has to do is to examine the results of the EU's cap and tax scheme. It was a failure. CO2 emissions in the U.S. fell by 1.8% in 2006, compared to a 0.3% increase in emissions in the EU, according to the EIA. Both economies grew at near identical pace in 2006 of about 3%. Cap and tax, cap and trade will essentially kick working families when they're down. And we thought the American public was angry at $4.25 gas prices last summer. Just wait till they get their hands on their utility bills under cap and tax. In 2008, approximately 21% of all utility accounts were overdue, with folks carrying past due balances on average of $160 on an electric bill and $360 for natural gas. And in Michigan, the account debt totaled $367 million, with 1 out of 3 behind on their bills in some of our areas. Times are tough, yet this proposal puts a bullseye on the back of working families who are struggling to feed their families to keep the lights on. And in fact, in Michigan, came out just yesterday that we have lost 150,000 jobs in 4 months. And it's expected that, according to the University of Michigan, we're going to lose 239,000 jobs in 2009. We're one of the hardest hit in this weak economy, and we would be disproportionately impacted with this legislation. NAM did a detailed analysis of the impact on Michigan. And quite simply, jobs are going to be lost, electric prices are going to go up, and household incomes will be decimated, and any growth will absolutely disappear. Let's put the scale of emissions reductions called for into perspective. Current proposals would mean that the U.S. cannot emit more in the year 2050 than we emitted in 1910. That's a pretty daunting task, considering that in 1910 the U.S. had only 92 million people compared to about 420 million expected in 2050. And to reach the lofty goal of 80% reductions, emissions from the entire transportation sector would have to drop to zero. Emissions from all electricity generation would have to drop to zero, and then we'd need to reduce everything else by 50%. Climate change is a serious problem that necessitates serious solutions. But how can we address such a critical issue without nuclear even being addressed in this measure, even though nuclear power accounts for 70% of our nation's emission-free electricity? We are in desperate need of a reality check. Without international participation, jobs and emissions will simply shift overseas to countries that require few, if any, environmental protections, harming the global environment as well as the U.S. economy. If our objective is to send manufacturing jobs overseas, destroy the Midwest, mortgage our future, and hand the keys over to our superpower status, then I would say job well done. This bill does it. The stakes are high, the planet is warming, and this is no time to throw in the towel, all in the name of cap and tax. So I guess, Mr. Chairman, you can put my name as undecided with Mr. Barton. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Upton.